could we move on to our next speaker, who is Hugh Whittall, who has been director of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics since 2007, and the Council's role is to identify ethical questions raised by new developments in biological and medical research that are of public concern, and that indeed to promote discussion around these questions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and in a way I think I've just come in at the right moment, because that last question is perhaps precisely the point to which a lot of our work is addressed. So I should just say the Nuffield Council on Bioethics is, we've been around for about 20 years. We're an independent body. Our funders are there, MRC, Nuffield Foundation, the Wellcome Trust. Our task is to identify ethical questions arising out of developments in biological and medical research, to try and bring these into a kind of public space for public discussion, but also to make reports to contribute towards policy making with recommendations. We took up the question about biofuels. Sorry, somebody's set this out for me. I hate these things that flash across, but I'm just going to have to go with it. We took on this question about ethical issues in biofuels because we recognised a number of things that were happening. Some of this has been touched on already. The main drivers that were developing biofuels were around the need to respond to climate change, energy security, and also economic development. And what we were seeing, certainly with first generation and potentially with subsequent generations, were concerns around the impact that this had on food prices, greenhouse gas emissions, where that was disputed whether they were contributing, issues around deforestation, workers' rights, land grabs, etc. And so what we wanted to do was to bring a systematic ethical analysis, gathering all of these things together in a way that I think had probably not been done before, and then to help inform what was clearly a timely policy development. We were addressing specifically questions around liquid biofuels, but of course much of this should be able to read across into other areas of fuel and energy. We brought together an expert working party involving people with a scientific and technical background, but also people from philosophy, law, ethics, and other relevant areas. I am not an expert. I'm, if you like, carrying the message on behalf of our experts, standing in for those who did the detailed work. So the starting point, if you like, was in looking at the field, identifying those moral values that could provide the basis for an ethical framework to apply in a way that could be operational, as it were. And these were the basic moral values, developed on the notion of an overlapping consensus, so that we might not all of us specifically go to these. We could nevertheless, most people, wherever we come from, recognise these as values that were going to be important to us. But these are quite difficult to apply in very precise operational terms. So from this, we then developed a number of specific ethical principles, which would be easier to use in clear and specific terms as a way of helping evaluate the use of biofuels and the development of biofuels policy. So these are 5 specific principles that in order to maintain those values that we'd set out. First, the development of biofuels should not be at the expense of people's essential human rights. Secondly, they should be environmentally sustainable. Third, that they should contribute to a net reduction of total greenhouse gas emissions, that they should adhere to fair trade principles, and that costs and benefits of biofuels should be distributed equitably. We could open up all of these, and I'll talk about them in detail in a moment, but really this is a quick run through this. And in a way, these represent red lines, if you like, to say that if you transgress any of these, then stop. I mean, it's obviously a bit more complex than that, as always in policy terms. But what one might say is that whilst these are, warnings, one can also arrive at a duty if you see that if these 5 principles can all be met and subject to any other particular considerations, if they are respected, one might say we have a duty from an ethical point of view to develop biofuels. So I'll talk about some specific implications and conclusions from this in a moment. But I just wanted to say that the ethical concerns that we talked about have arisen as a result of the rapid adoption of early generation biofuels, and these were driven largely by policy. Policy targets drove the increasing production of biofuels, and we've looked specifically at liquid biofuels here. But of course, whilst that is a kind of narrow focus, one can see that in a sense this could, if we tried to apply these strict standards in this area, this could disadvantage biofuels over other options, whether it's in terms of land use or energy production. So one could see how these principles could and should perhaps be used to benchmark other types of technology or products, whether it's in bioenergy, agricultural production, or even non-bio technologies. So on the first of the principles, human rights, we should ensure that our targets do not effectively incentivize human rights abuse in the sense that they encourage production in places where scaling up can be done relatively easily, and we had seen that sometimes this is in countries with a lack of regulation. We need to have monitoring systems that can identify that, and the conclusion that we reach is that whilst the Renewable Energy Directive has incorporated a certain commitment to human rights, it's only asking, and other sustainability standards, it's only asking them to be reported. There is no sufficient enforcement mechanism. So what we need to see, rather than simply biennial reporting, we want a certification system based on comprehensive standards for all biofuels developed, both within and outside the EU. Otherwise, we are simply displacing the problems. There are examples of this, for example, with the Roundtable on Sustainable Biofuels, which is a voluntary scheme that could or should, we have argued, be made mandatory. Environmental sustainability, the key recommendation that we arrive at is not unrelated to that. It is around sustainability standards for biofuels production. Again, the target-driven expansion of biofuels production has contributed to biodiversity loss, where forests or grassland, etc., have been cleared for the purpose of growing biofuels crops, or through indirect land use change. So if we want the best possible standard for environmental sustainability, again, this would need to be implemented as part of a certification scheme that would need to be mandatory and enforceable. And this, again, it's arguable that the RED and the RTFO in this country simply do not have the enforceability mechanisms within them at the moment. Moreover, we really ought to be promoting research to investigate the application of biotechnologies for genetic improvement of crops, so that they have the capacity to give us better environmental performance. The third of our principles was around ensuring that the development of biofuels did indeed address global climate change with the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Once again, the targets can inadvertently offer incentives for those countries that don't have mitigation policies in place to increase their production levels, and there's a lack of control at that point on greenhouse gas emissions. The RED, the Renewable Energy Directive, has got requirements for net greenhouse gas emissions which are counted towards European targets, but the instruments available to ensure that those reductions are met where production is outside the EU, again, risk outsourcing a problem from Europe to other parts of the world. So we need a single international standard for greenhouse gas emissions if we are to meet this principle that derives from the need to mitigate climate change. The fourth of the principles concerns what we call just reward. Low wages, unfair prices for farmers and for labourers have been associated with biofuel production in developing countries. On the other hand, we can see the potential for them to benefit by having potentially a global marketplace in which they can contribute and get additional income, additional jobs through a market that they can contribute to. But we need to, if we're going to see that and we're going to see this just reward, we need to ensure that we promote fair trade principles. So the EU and national trade principles incorporated into our biofuels policies and the regulation of biofuels need to be proportionate and considerate of those other countries' requirements, protecting those populations who are most vulnerable, which is where, in effect, the production could be displaced to simply because we find it cheaper and easier to produce there. The fifth and of the key principles is around equitable distribution. The costs and benefits of biofuel production go beyond simply financial losses and gains and beyond simply the reduction in greenhouse gas emission that clearly we must look for. But there are also associated environmental, political, social and economic issues that confer benefits and burdens differentially in different ways. So, for example, we might invest in biofuels to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If this results in the imposition of burdens in terms of human rights for workers or for communities or loss of land, whilst delivering benefits principally for those of us in the developed world, we simply must recognise that this is an inequitable distribution. So our policies need to be balanced to meet the needs both of an international community and potentially of more local communities. So, for example, if we are to develop an international standard, an international certification scheme, we should not let that, for example, work against the possibility of local production to meet local needs in areas where there is poor distribution and poor access to energy by other means. So, finally, I've mentioned this duty. So if we are in a position where we can produce biofuels or bioenergy indeed that meet those 5 principles, then we could go on to say that we have a duty indeed to produce those biofuels. But that is not like any other duty, it doesn't come at any cost. So before we go so far as to say that we must, as an ethical responsibility, develop biofuels further, we should ask ourselves a number of things about whether the absolute cost is proportionate to the benefits, whether competing energy sources might actually provide better advantages in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whether there are alternative uses of the crops that actually give us better outcomes, and whether there is uncertainty, particularly around questions about locking into technologies that might have irreversible consequences. So these are considerations that would need to be applied before we go so far as to say that we have a duty. So briefly, just to gather that all up, what we concluded was that policies at EU level and the UK level, by being target-driven in a rather simplistic way, actually risked driving practices that were essentially unethical in their outcomes. And this is where our principles are driven at. So what we need is a more sophisticated target-based strategy where we can introduce the comprehensive ethical standard, and as we say, and this is where I think I pick up from the end of the last speaker, monitoring effects is important, but being able to respond to that, to respond to it with instruments that can actually bring about some change, requires a certification scheme with clear sanctions. We need investment in new technologies that will provide us, if you like, with either better energy efficiency or alternative uses of land or use of land that is not going to be in competition. The standards can pick up all of these, what we're starting to refer to as social sustainability criteria. And there is in some ways an argument that this simply adds to the cost, and in a way that might be true. It adds to the burden of producing biofuels. That would put them in an adverse position in terms of competition with other types of activity. Well, let's carry these standards across to others. There might be an argument that industry would be resistant to incorporating these kind of standards, but actually we've heard from BP about some enthusiasm for that. And I think that if industry can see that there are high-level, durable standards that if they are assured that they're meeting them, then the market is prepared to pay for them, then I think there is no difficulty in aiming a little bit higher in terms of the standards that we are going to ask for. We have got a good starting point for this, which is in the roundtable on sustainable biofuels. And again, as I said before, we can apply that kind of standard to other energy and non-energy products as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.